Let's wait for a couple of minutes. Hello, everyone. So we are going to start in a few minutes. So welcome to the second keynote of OAP. So we are very, very proud of having Mona today with us. So I will say a few words about Mona, and then after Mona will start keynote. Okay. So Mona is currently serving as professor in peace and development research at the at the School of Global Studies, at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And Lilia's areas of interest is the concept of power and resistance, with a special focus upon the linkages between resistance and social change, as well as the particularities, the character and emergence of various forms of resistance. In focus are the discourses, performance, and identities created by those engaged in resistance practices. What relationships enable or constrain articulations of resistance? In terms of publications, Lilia has been focusing on resistance, among other things, and her work has been appearing in resistance studies, Norma, Nora, Journal of Politic Powers, Science, Asian Perspectives, but also the Feminist Review, and in a monograph about resisting gender norms, civil society, the juridical and political space in Cambodia. So she has also edited a number of books, and she is a co-founder of the Resistance Studies Network. So welcome on board, Mona. So we are very proud of having you today for this second keynote of OAP. So the floor is yours. And then after, I hope we will have time for discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. I'm here today to discuss Foucault's notion of time and resistance. And I will depart from my new book on constructive resistance. I don't know if you see it there. Yeah. That's great. First, I will elaborate a bit on the concept of resistance. And thereafter, I'm going to try to show how time is visible in Foucault's theories of resistance. And finally, I will come back to constructive resistance and see how the time resistance nexus of Foucault, how you can interpret that, analyze that in terms of constructive resistance. So I'm thinking let us start with some reflections on resistance and resistance studies. There has been a great focus in resistance studies on organized forms of resistance. Early, there was a focus on the obvious, violent, dramatic forms of resistance. And later on, you can say that this was complemented with research on more everyday and localized and individual forms of resistance. And here we have, for example, research on everyday resistance. This research often draw on James Scott and Michael Foucault's notion of counter-conduct, which often is used to put light on less visible forms of politics. We have also various kinds of meaning-making resistance, which is individual. I'm thinking about Roland Blake's book on popular dissent, for example, which is about discursive resistance. Judith Butler's notion of performativity, which is about how you use your identities and you can repeat your identity a little bit different. But also decolonizing resistance, such as Baba, and his concept of hybridity. So, but more generally, you can say that there's a divide in resistance studies between people who do research on organized resistance and people who do research on individual resistance. And lately, these two strands have been complemented with resistance research on constructive resistance. And you can say that there is a tendency to reduce resistance to reactive practices of opposition. But when we look at actual processes of resistance, we find excess and creative messiness of different resistance tactics. So resistance can create social and political change beyond the mere opposition of power. And you can say that constructive resistance is a practice that might undermine different moods and aspects of power in the enactments and constructions of alternatives. So alternatives is a key word here. Constructive resistance is dissent that opposes existing forms of power through constructing new discourses, identities, movements. You could see the Me Too movement as a form of constructive resistance, for example, where a new narrative of sexual abuse was constructed in the movement. So I would say that there's also two strands within the research on constructive resistance. First, we have the researchers who are looking for utopias, that is embodied visions of alternative societies and organizations, while there are other researchers who look more for meaning-making resistance. As I mentioned before, Roland Blake, who says that the most powerful practice of dissent work in discursive way, that is by engendering a slow transformation of values. So, and of course we also have other kind of post-colonial research here, which challenge dominant narratives in order to construct and propose alternative discourses. I suggest that Foucault's research is often about constructive resistance. Among others, he discusses resistance as alternative constructions of the future or alternative images of a future self, and so on and so forth. You can say that constructive resistance, while proposing alternatives, also cooperate or coexist with non-cooperative forms of resistance. That kind of resistance where you say no, you refuse to cooperate, you oppose power. So many practices of resistance contain both constructive elements but also non-cooperative elements, and they in fact coexist, co-work to undermine relations of power. You can say that it's a sliding scale, how constructive the resistance is and how much it contains non-cooperative elements. So I will come back to the concept of constructive resistance later on. But let's say something about time before we move on to Foucault and his various kinds of resistance and how you can analyze them in temporal terms. So as you agree with me, I suppose, time has increasingly been pointed out as an important concept to analyze current situations. So it is used to uncover new dimensions of temporal politics or of different power relations, the time scales of environmental crisis, the structure of postmodern society. And research in the field, as I comprehend it, also explores repetitions and how repetitions over time might cause a change in power. And I mean, this research is imperative to understand how discourses, but also narratives, evolve over time, right? So this research within time-related issues also address artifacts and books and how they take on their own time perspectives and are sometimes transmitted across generations and remind us of previous historical moments and also tie different periods of time together, right? So time is an important issue, and if you analyze Foucault's different kinds of resistance concepts, each modality of resistance is possible to interrogate from a time perspective in order to find out what temporality is at stake. So I have been interested in looking at when is resistance, in Foucault's view, instant rather than slow, how is resistance played out across a range of temporal scales. So that has been my main aim. And one chapter in the book on constructive resistance is about Foucault's time resistance nexus. So, and that is the chapter that I will talk about today. So, I mean, Foucault elaborates in the 80s. I remember that people always said that Foucault never elaborated on resistance, only on power, but that is in fact not true. I mean, Foucault has several concepts of resistance, which are quite different, in fact, in character. And I'm going to talk about what I call discursive resistance in Foucault's work. That includes reverse discourse, even though I will not take up that concept today. He also talks about counterconducts. He talks about anti-authority struggles. And he also talks about technologies of the self. And as I interpret it, that would also be a strategy of resistance, and can be a strategy of resistance. So I would suggest that all these forms of resistance bear a temporal logic of their own, or use temporal means in their resistance. So analyzing Foucault's three theories of resistance, is possible to detect both ruptures, time lag, but also kind of slow resistance, which I find is interesting as a resistance researcher. So I'm thinking that we could turn now to the first dimension of resistance that Foucault mentions, and that would be the discursive resistance. Sometimes Foucault displays the existence of marginalized alternatives and challenging discourses as a kind of resistance, such when he discusses subjugated knowledge or historical knowledge struggles. But in other texts, Foucault shows the complexity of each and every discourse, and how one single discourse contains traces of both power and resistance. So as a discursive phenomena, resistance is pictured as creative and very small scale practices, but still with the ability to create real change. So political struggles and subversive act occurs as micro complexities with virgin sentences, and thereby inform dominant discourses. It is resistance that constantly pop up in networks of power, and also you can say the power, it depends on this messiness of points of resistance. I would say that this is kind of resistance that inspire other forms of resistance. Again, we can go back to the Me Too movement, where people spelled out sentences and words that inspired other people to repeat similar stories. So it's resistance that give rise to resistance. And Foucault picture this resistance as swarms of points entangled in power. And I'm thinking that I will read two quotes here. Foucault says in The History of Sexuality, okay, I read, "Are there no great radical ruptures, massive binary divisions then? Occasionally, yes, but more often one is dealing with mobile and transitory points of resistance." In another place in the same book, he illuminates the strict relational character of power and resistance. So he states that, I read again, he states that power relations depend on a multiplicity of points of resistance. These play the role of adversary, target, support, or handle in power relations. These points of resistance are present everywhere in power network. So, This is interesting, right? So according to Foucault, the web of power and resistance seem to occur in long processes that rely upon the specific temporality of long-term discursive processes. And I would say, my guess is that the close relationship between power and resistance and the interaction and struggle between the points of resistance and power probably slow down the effects of resistance. And by time, however, these microcurrencies of resistance in the discursive networks can transform and change what we know and who we are. Right? So resistance is about long-term, irregular time process, which still, according to Foucault, can give rise to revolution. So he says this. He says that it's doubtless the strategic codification of these points of resistance that makes a revolution possible. But there seemed to be a time delay in this kind of resistance. And that could be interpreted through Homi Bhabha's theories of narratives. So Bhabha states that for those who are in a subaltern position in relation to hegemonic truth regimes, there's a time lag between the establishment of new alternative truths and the people narrating these truths. Okay, so when resisting is challenging dominant discourses, there is always a delay. There's a time lag. This kind of resistance is a slow resistance that give effect and could give major effect, but after a while. So I would say that this is give us a specific time frame. It's a kind of resistance that is very particular in its temporality. But if we move to other kinds of resistance that Foucault brings up, we see a totally different pattern. And I'm thinking about his 1982 piece, The Subject and Power, where he addresses resistance, not as discursive resistance, but as anti-authority struggles. These kind of struggles prevail as very localist practices, with subjects interacting with authorities in the present, in the now, in order to object forms of individualization and subjectivization. So these struggles assert the right to be different and oppose the effects of power. So Foucault is very clear about that. It's the effects of power that people are opposing. And the struggles are struggle against the privilege of knowledge. So, but these struggles, they are very much played out against the immediate enemy. So people are not looking for the chief enemy, or they are not aiming to create liberation, revolutions, or putting an end to class struggle. But it's resistance that appear here and now. So it's about struggling with power's effect on people and the close by enemies. So this implies that people they want to find a solution to the problems, but not in the future, but now, here and now. And also you can say that this resistance is not really formulated in relation to people in the past or people in the future. It has a long time period or brings in future prospects, which could motivate for a revolution, but it's struggle here. So anti-authority struggles is resistance that revolve around the present, and it seems to partly overlap with what Foucault labels as counterconduct. Still, it's very much pinpointed in Foucault's texts as a specific form of struggle. So if you move on and look more about how Foucault talks about authority, he actually has sections where authority is connected directly to different time issues. He shows, among other things, that control of time is fundamental for disciplinary power. And what stands out here is, for example, the importance of timetables, schedules, the efficiency of working life and the efficiency of the time of workers. So there has been a move from task-oriented time to a time that is very much valued in money. So each and every employer use the time of his or her workers to ensure that the time is not wasted. According to Foucault, timetables have different functions. They, among other things, establish a rhythm, but they also regulate cycles of repetition, so with different intervals. So through effective time use and clear time frames, bodies are both controlled and disciplined. And Foucault states, in Discipline and Punish, he states this, I read, "Time measured and paid must also be a time without impurities or defects, a time of good quality through which the body is constantly applied to its exercise." So according to Foucault, authorities and institutions, they tend to work towards an accelerated time, and thereby creating specific moods of subjectivity and disciplined bodies. In Discipline and Punish, he describes how using time more effectively entangle with different self-disciplinary practices. And he says that discipline, okay, I read, arranges a positive economy. It poses the principle of a theoretically ever-growing use of time. This means that one must seek to intensify the use of the slightest moment. So he also states that it becomes important to try to get maintained maximum speed and maximum efficiency. So the subject intensifies the use of every moment and strives towards an optimum point in which one could maintain maximum speed. And schools, for example, are pointed out by Foucault as institutions that come to work as machines to intensify the use of time. And here it's not only about accelerating the process of learning, but it's also about teaching speed as a virtue. So putting up speed and as a norm in society. So the accelerated tempo entangled in subjectivities and also contemporary forms of human experience kind of interact with different discourses that put up the speed as a norm, so to speak. If we embraces that Foucault always thinks that power is related to and constructed in relation to resistance, we might consider the acceleration as a form of resistance to this accelerated tempo, right? So to slow down time and create another rhythm, you can resist the accelerated tempo. So that is kind of doing time differently than, for example, schools and other institutions are expecting you to do. So still you can also see taking it slower as a kind of survive in an accelerated tempo, right? So it could also in some senses be seen as a disciplinary strategy, ways in which people try to adapt to survive in a contemporary accelerated time. So I'm thinking that we should sum up. Analyzing discursive resistance and anti-authority struggles from the notion of time makes visible that each and every form of resistance has its own temporality. While discursive resistance is performed over a longer time period and is only effective after some time, anti-authority struggles is performed now to create change now. Right? However, if we move on and look at Foucault's other concepts of resistance, we get other research results. So if you scrutinize, for example, counterconducts and Foucault's techniques of the self as forms of resistance, we see that here temporal images are produced and drawn on as a form of resistance. So it's a bit different. So I'm thinking that let us move on to look at counter-conduct and how Foucault addresses that. In 1978, in a lecture entitled Security, Territory and Population, Foucault discussed counter-conduct as a struggle against what he says the processes implemented for conducting others. So Foucault connects the phrase counter-conduct to his understanding of the Middle Age, and he states that the governing then, as a project of governing subjects, it was set up with such an intensity so that provoked counter-conducts. But he says that also that similar analysis could be made in regard to governmentality in its modern forms. So it's a strategy of the past as well as the present. And you can see counter-conduct as revolts of conduct. And if you read Foucault's text, you find that they can be either organized or individually expressed. So they can either be accomplished in networks, but also one by one. So in his argumentation on counter-conducts, Foucault refers to reason of the state as the law of modern governmentality. So population could expect to live with the reason of the state in an indefinite time. So there's no hope of getting done with it. It's just here to stay. And so the counter-conduct against this narrative took and still take a very temporal form. So the politics of the state will be brought to an end, and when doing counter-conduct, the population the possibility of a final time, and time when the politics of the state is brought to an end. It is when civil society can kind of free itself from the constraints and the controls of the state. According to Foucault, this narrative of civil society is formulated as a temporal narrative. So he says that the time, if not of history, then at least of politics of the state will come to an end. And he actually phrases this whole discourse as a temporal discourse. He speaks about it as when time will end, a final time, a suspension of completion of historical and political time. So, and that is the time when the indefinite governmentality of the state will be brought to an end and halted. So, you can say that resistance in this kind of framed as counter-conduct is pictured as a major rupture that will take place. It's like a timeless phase that will start without the time of politics, without the time of the politics of the state. So it's played out through an imaginary of another timeless future and a description of major ruptures. So the resistance itself is the imaginaries and the narratives of this new phase. And the resistance is directed towards the state as an authority and as a possessor of the truth. So here we have another pattern when we look at Foucault's approach to resistance. I'm thinking that we take it one step further and move to the techniques of the self. Another strategy of dissent over and about counter-conducts is self-making, care of the self, which counter dominant relations of power and expected subject positions. So it's when subjects refuses to take on the subject's positions that are designed for them and choose to do something else, to repeat themselves differently, perform another alternative subject position. And as you probably all know, at the presentation at Berkeley in the 80s, Foucault elaborated on the potential of recreating subjectivity through the techniques of the self. The techniques of the self allow individuals to, through different operations on their own bodies and soul, transform themselves with the aim of attaining, for example, happiness, purity, or wisdom. Techniques of the self are possible to use as a norm conformative and neoliberal project of self-development, that is, to follow the discourses of power, to become a person that goes with the norms. But I would like to suggest that the techniques of the self also constitutes the possibility for subjects to transform themselves in a manner that is counter to existing dominating norms. So techniques of the self or care of the self can then be seen as another form of resistance, which could be detected in Foucault's texts. And techniques of the self display how individuals sometimes remold themselves counter to the kind of subjectivity that are provided in relations of power. And this resistance involves subjective processes, of course, but still it's embedded in the prevailing discourses. And as in other kinds of resistance, is also kind of resistance that inspire other people to resist. I mean, to also remold themselves in counter to the dominant discourses. If we look at techniques of the self from a time perspective, we can see that it is a political practice that involves remembering the past as well as narrating the future and the present. So this is, among other things, revealed in Foucault's outline of the classical ancient use of the notebook. So in his discussion of the notebook, Foucault embraces the time aspect of self-technology. He stresses that the notebooks is to be seen not only as external memory devices, but also that they are, I quote here, book of life guides for conduct. So in the books you were expected to write what you had experienced, what you have seen, what you have counted, but you also wrote down notes to yourself about how you wanted to develop in the future, how you wanted to reach happiness and morality. And you can say that the whole outline of these notebooks reveals or indicates that the techniques of the self involves a really complex relationship between the past, the future, and the present. So it's the individual who is portraying a self-image, but that involves expecting and predicting the future, and also time travels into different utopian scenarios as a part of a subversive resistance strategy of self-making. To this can be added that resistance itself over time impacts on our subjectivities. Foucault states, for example, in the history of sexuality that, now I read, the points, knots, or focuses of resistance are spread over time and space at varying densities, at times mobilizing groups or individuals in a infinite way, inflaming certain points of the body, certain moments in life, certain types of behavior. So resistance in itself impact on our identities and how we experience ourselves and how we are creating communities of belonging and so on and so forth. So I have now discussed some of Foucault's notions of resistance from a time perspective. So I'm thinking that it might be time for us to return to the notion of constructive resistance, and that is the production of alternative images, organizations, discourses, or identities as a creative and complex form of dissent. So I would say that there are several constructive moves in Foucault's research on temporal resistance. First of all, resistance is played out through the production of several time-related images. For example, as we saw, there is the image of the timeless future where the politics of the states is ruptured and we enter a new phase. That is a constructed image which pictures how the prolonged now, which is presented and upheld by the governing instances, is ruptured. And the construction of these alternative images of the future, that is, according to me at least, you can see that as a form of constructive resistance. And if these are embodied in now, that also makes the constructive resistance establishing an alternative here and now instead of waiting to the future. You can also see that the techniques of the self was used as resistance, and the techniques of the selves involves constructing and embodying other selves based on self-reflection and moral and critical considerations, right? So the resisting self-training, which is played out in relation to images of who you want to be in the future, or in relation to future potential courses of action, could also be seen as a form of constructive resistance, where you shape an alternative now in the present and thereby go against the suggested subject's position. Again, resistance here involves constructed imaginings of the future, as well as alternative identity positions. And moreover, when resistance is about establishing alternative discourses, this resistance has a temporality of its own, as I said before. Constructing alternative plots and get them known and accepted is a kind of slow motion resistance. So when new narratives are repeated over time, while opposing dominant storylines, the resistance becomes time-lagged. In addition, also doing time differently is a resistance strategy. So as stated above, Foucault in Discipline and Punish talked about an accelerated time and how governing instances and institutions speed up time and also teach speed as a virtue. But in relation to this, you can see that doing time differently, like slowing down time, prevails as a reasonable strategy of resistance. And that is about doing time in an alternative way, which could also be seen as establishing an alternative, doing things in an alternative way. We construct an alternative time by doing time differently. So other forms of dissent, as the anti-authoritative struggles, they are not necessarily constructive, but more instant and played out here and now. Still, that resistance strategy has a temporality of its own. So, if we are to sum up, we can say that different forms of resistance, which are promoted by Foucault, not only imply alternative identities, alternative discourses, alternative organizations, but they also imply alternative temporalities, while time also can be seen as means of resistance. For example, when time is done differently as resistance, or when resistance is repeated over time. So the question is then, what kind of time concepts can we find in Foucault's discussion on resistance? So let's turn it around. Well, first of all, I would say that as Foucault pictured resistance as an instant act, but also as a irregular repetition over time, he kind of suggests everyday time as everyday biological processes, right? Time that proceeds moment by moment when things and bodies are aging. However, in other texts, Foucault instead addresses how we constantly do time when we organize, understand, spend time in different ways. Time is made in every moment, and the enactment of different temporalities is to some extent productive, and bodies act out temporalities which they thereby contribute to establish. So this pattern appears as Foucault, for example, discusses how time could be speeded up, so we can use time in new ways. So over and about that, we see that Foucault constantly produce different time imaginaries. So that would also be a way that Foucault can use his time in his scholarship. And finally, I'm thinking that when we discuss techniques of the self, that is about knitting time together. Here, Foucault discusses how people refer both to the future, past, and the now, which they relate to and draw on as they construct themselves differently. So you can say that Foucault's outline of how the present is connected with the past and the future questions the whole idea about the present as a linear singular movement. Right? Instead, he suggests that it's a collapse of time where we experience multiple temporalities operating in the same moment. So that would be maybe a fourth way that Foucault uses time in his framing of different resistance practices. So, looking at Foucault's time resistance concept and time concept, and particularly in his resistance scholarship or literature on resistance, we find a broad and messy production of dissent. So what becomes apparent is how connected power and resistance are. And various forms of resistance are shaped by power relations. So you can see that if power is expressed or understood as decision-making power by authorities, which have the ability to affect certain outcomes, then we find that the resistance that is generated is non-cooperative, saying no, opposing. While when power is described as a discursive phenomenon, where it's long-term patterning relationships going on, which contains both power and resistance, then they are talking very closely to each other in these long-term processes. And summing up, reviewing Foucault's scholarship on time and resistance, we find a lot of interesting examples of both non-cooperative and constructive resistance. And we find that time matters in all his formulations of resistance. Thank you so much for your time. Someone has any questions, maybe? Okay, I'm reading the chat to see if there are any.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mona, for your great, inspiring talk. When I heard you, I kept thinking about one of the keynotes we had last year, and it was Hartmut Rosa. And it was interesting because at some point he also spoke about slowing down, and but saying something very different, because what he says is that for him it's not really the right way to resist. And he sent more to suggest alternative temporal structures. And of course, he kept insisting on the issue of resonance and saying that slowing down doesn't necessarily set up phenomenologically a more resonant situation. So I would be very curious to have your opinion about this subtle difference between Foucault and what appears as some critical approaches, contemporary critical approaches, as Hartmut Rosa approach of acceleration and slowing down.
When I met Hartmut Rosa's, I actually went to Keynote with Hartmut Rosa also a couple of years ago, and when he talks about slowing down time, I experienced that he sees that more as an effect of power, that people try to slow down. They go to meditation camps and they try to in different way handle the speeded up tempo by slowing down, or create small spaces where you can slow down in order to just move on, coping with this tempo. But I would say that, of course, I mean, you can take Foucault's theories a step further and also say that if he considers schools as institutions that speed up the tempo and accelerate tempo, then I mean, you probably need to do broader, more through changes in institutions and structures to really get to the problem. But I also think that you can read him as if resistance is about slowing down. It depends on what perspective you take, if you go for an agency-oriented perspective or not, I assume. Yeah, someone says in the chat that Rosa seems skeptical about resistance slowing down. Yes.
I think there is a question from Ayan in the chat as well. It's the question before, I think.
Yeah, I think that can I ask, someone asks here in the chat that I mentioned repetition as a form of resistance. Would you explain this aspect, please? And actually in my new book, repetition is one of the 3 themes that I take up. And I think that repetition is a crucial issue for when you want to discuss repetition, resistance. Not only because resistance is often about repeating differently and choose not to repeat what is expected from you as repetition, but I also think that repetition is you need to study repetition in order to see what kind of repetition that is, what kind of resistance that is effective. I mean, considering, for example, that you are out driving your car and it comes a sign going, look up for the moose, and you go like, oh wow, oh, there could be a big animal in front of my car soon, and I really need to look up. Then after you see a sign, another sign saying the same thing, and another sign, you stop listening to the sign, okay? So you know when the exact same sign comes up, look up for the moose, you don't think that there might be a moose because you've seen the signs so many times, right? So the reading of the repetition has changed, even though it's exactly the same thing that is repeated. You see what I mean? So, and it's the same with resistance. If you go, you can do resistance in a certain way, but when you have done that 10 times, people stop listening to you. You need to change your strategy of resistance in order to make people listen to you, in order to have effect. But that is only one aspect of why repetitions are important when you look at resistance.
There is also another question. Did you also consider Foucault's conceptions of biopolitic and biopolitical struggles in your conception of resistance? This seems to be particularly important today with the rise of mass surveillance of populations, racist wars of aggression and torture that have received bipartisan support in the US and Europe, far-right populism in US, and European politics, among other things.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you discuss Foucault's conception of biopolitics, there's a risk that the resistance just confirm power. For example, we have in Sweden a small community that goes against the state. They don't want to take any vaccine. They want to have their own healthcare and so on and so forth. But this kind of community just, in fact, give more power to the state and strengthen the politics of the state. They prevail as odd and different. They become the other, while the mainstream discourses grow stronger in relationship to resistance. And that is also what I took up now during the lecture, that sometimes resistance supports power and sometimes also creates power, because when power reacts to resistance, we have new forms and sometimes stronger power relations than we had before. And I mean, power needs to be creative too in order to respond to resistance. So I think that it's very, very interesting to look at particular forms of power and see how they entangle in resistance and how they provoke each other. Paper copy. Yeah, you can download my book for free at Roman's homepage. It's open access, so you don't have to wait for the paper copy.
Very much. We'll share if you have the precise link, we can share it.
Okay, I guess
the link to the open access version of your book, because we diffused a commercial link, I think. I don't know if there are other comments or question. Yes, Tim.
Thanks, Francois. Thanks for a really thought-provoking talk, Mona. I was just wondering about this phrase "doing time differently" that you mentioned a few times in your talk, and maybe just if you had a few examples of doing time differently, or what's needed so that we can do time differently.
Well, I'm thinking about the de-acceleration as doing time differently in this case. And I mean, we see a huge trend of people. A lot of people are moving nowadays from the Netherlands, from Germany to Sweden. And especially they want to go to a place called Värmland, which is like far into the country, where they want to, and they move there in order to do time differently. They don't want to do time in the same way. They don't want to have this speeded up tempo. They want to slow down. And it's like a movement of people going to Sweden to slow down and do time differently. And I think that is tremendously interesting. But then I'm not sure that kind of resistance has an effect. And maybe that's why I'm so skeptical. Because there are so few that they easily become like the example that really strengthen instead the main discourse about how you need to accelerate time. So you never know.
And we have another interesting question or reaction from Graham saying, so time then as a function of space, as in the way you conceptualize time, would you say that? Would you confirm that?
Time then a function of space. Oh wow, yeah, that's interesting. That's we must elaborate more on that. But yes, apparently time and space is very interconnected in this kind of resistance. Anyone has a suggestion of how to formulate that?
What is great is that it's a beautiful transition with our panel, which deals with Foucault, but another Foucault, much more interested in space and the panopticon and that kind of things. Maybe well known in our communities, I mean in organization studies, the Foucault you described about time and temporality is probably not that present, and this is precisely what will be the topic of the next discussion. So this question and your answer is a great transition to the last phase. If there are no other questions or reactions, what I propose is to to stop at this point. We are right on time. We want to say a warm thank you, Mona. It was very interesting, very stimulating. And
Thank you so
I
much.
look forward to reading your book.
Oh, I didn't find the link.
Double the pleasure.
Yeah, but you can find it on ResearchGate Academia, so it wouldn't be too difficult. But thank you anyhow. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to be here, and very interesting questions too. Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you very much.
I just would like to take this opportunity to say to everyone that we will have a few minutes break before switching to the panel, okay? Because we need some kind of manual manipulation to switch from one to another in terms of YouTube streaming. So you can use like this 5 minutes break, okay?